Well, welcome, Matthew. It's a pleasure to have you here and to have this discussion with you about you and your work and your book, Embodied Kabbalah. And I thought we might start off with something very, very basic, which is perhaps you could just explain to us in very simple, down-to-earth terms what the Kabbalah is.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. It's good to be in conversation with you. I suppose there are many ways that one could define Kabbalah, and even that pronunciation, Kabbalah versus Kabbalah. I tend not to use the definite article, the Kabbalah, though I know many people do. When I use the word Kabbalah in my book, Embodied Kabbalah, and often in my teaching, what I mean is the whole entirety of Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality. Academically, the precision one could use the word Kabbalah with is to say a particular form of Jewish mysticism which first arose, or at least which was first written down in the Middle Ages, and whose central teachings revolve around what's called the Tree of Life, or the 10 Sefirot, these gradations, these divine emanations or layers of reality between us and the infinite. It's essentially a system and a form of practice and teaching which explains the nature of reality and also gives us understandings of how we can attain deeper access to that.
Very interesting. Maybe you could go into a little bit more detail about the Tree of Life and its details and how it enables the individual to relate to higher divine realities.
Absolutely. So one of the theories of how Kabbalah arose is that it really first emerged after one of our greatest philosophers, Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, who was a medieval philosopher very informed by Aristotle's theology and science. He essentially said, which was very contrary to a lot of the dominant theology of his time, that basically we can't say anything about God. The divine true reality is beyond all our understanding. And anytime in the Bible, for example, it talks about God's arm or, God's face, and that's all a metaphor simply pointing at a reality which we truly cannot describe at all. And so a lot of the Kabbalists, early Kabbalists who wrote these first books, they were raised on Maimonides' philosophy, which essentially said, well, there's our world and then there's God, and we can't really know anything about God. And it sort of left this gap in reality. And so in some sense, the Tree of Life, these gradations are filling in that gap between our very tangible physical reality and the great unknown of the infinite. So in that way, it can be seen as a ladder, and that's a ladder both from the infinite into our world, that when the physical world comes into being, it starts first with the highest emanation, which is actually akin to nothingness. It's a paradoxical world where you can't really say much about that either. It doesn't, not really bound by rationality, but in a sense, before the infinite creates something, first the infinite creates nothing. And that nothingness at the very tip top is known as Keter, the crown, also associated with the divine will. After that is the Sefirah, or the emanation of Chokhmah, which translates to wisdom, and that's seen as the very first spark of somethingness. It's akin, some people today compare it to, before the Big Bang, there was that micro atom that wasn't even quite existence, but everything was contained therein, like the seed of all reality. And around Chokhmah, this wisdom forms Bina, which is like a mirror, a chamber of mirrors, an echo chamber, a womb, also known as the supernal or the divine mother, which essentially births between Chokhmah and Bina, between what's called wisdom and understanding. The spiritual realm is birthed, and that is composed primarily of 6 emanations. And the 6 are, in brief, loving kindness, power or boundaries, harmony, to harmonize between the loving kindness and the boundaries, sort of the yes and the no is harmonized by a type of compassion. Below that is Netzach and Hod, which could be described as pure action and pure yielding. Some version of that's like a marching forward versus a waiting and acceptance. And then finally, the sense of integration or connection, which yields the final Sephirah, the final emanation, which for us in our physical reality is the first one we access, known as Malchut or Shekhinah, which loosely translates to kingdom or to divine presence. And that is understood as the receiver of all the divine energies, which then births our physical world. And if people in our world are connecting to the beyond, it's understood that Shekhinah, that final Sephirah, is the lens or the dimension through which all of that is channeled. So our spiritual experience, our spiritual lives, in a sense, awaken when we first make contact with that nearest Sephirah, that nearest emanation.
Well, that was very clear and very cogent, very impressive discussion of some rather abstract issues. Another main doctrine of the Kabbalah is 4 worlds. There is the tree of life and the 10 sefirot, and then there are the 4 worlds. Would you like to go into that teaching a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to note, this is sort of a brief history of everything here. People
Right.
can cultivate a relationship to one of the sefirot probably for an entire lifetime. You know what I'm saying? And so this is the schema. This is the big picture, but experientially, there's a lot more time involved and a lot more subtlety, of course. And so the 4 worlds, interestingly, is not found in the original documents of Kabbalah, whereas the Sefirot, this tree of life, is referenced right from the outset. The 4 worlds doesn't even appear in the first major work of Kabbalah, which is the Zohar. It comes somewhere between that and sort of the next major movement of the 1500s, known as Lurianic Kabbalah. In any case, it is a way in one sense of understanding the Sefirot, the tree of life, in smaller groupings. But one of my personal favorite teachings about the 4 worlds comes quite recently from a teacher of mine, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who passed away just in 2014. And it's a very tangible approach. He broke down the 4 worlds, or the 4 dimensions, into physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. So you can understand perhaps how the divine has these worlds about it. And we also have these worlds in ourselves. So our physical is our body, emotional, our hearts, so to speak, our metaphorical hearts. Our mind is that's our intellect, that's our mind, that's our brain. And the spiritual world is our soul. And so if someone is experientially trying to find balance, and really in much of Kabbalah, much of Jewish mysticism, the goal is about integration and balance. It's that back and forth between transcending and including, transcending and connecting. So I might have great ideas. I might have profound spiritual experience. I could be someone who has prophetic moments and predicts the future. But if I'm not emotionally aware, if I'm not emotionally mature, if I don't have a healthy relationship to my own body, if I'm not living in such a way that I'm grounded and that I'm, let's say, getting good sleep when I need, and eating nourishing food and all of those kinds of things, having healthy emotional connections, I'm not going to be able to be the same kind of teacher, or really, I can't be a blessing to this world if I'm not connected with it. So the 4 worlds, just in the most practical sense, is an extremely beneficial system for considering our balance. And similarly, there's a lot of people who are raised to have lots of exercise and lifting weights and working on their bodies. And maybe, let's say in Western culture, something else that's emphasized a lot is the mind. I can be a genius and also be super fit and those kinds of things, but I might not have emotional awareness or emotional connectivity. I might not understand who I am. And I might not have opened up to anything intuitive or transcendent or spiritual. And in that sense, too, that's not quite balanced in the sense of the holistic person. So the goal really is to be actualizing and to be cultivating our health and our well-being in all of those 4 worlds. And so that, in its most practical sense, is a usefulness of the 4 worlds model. But if I were to graft it on, or to articulate it through a more classical Kabbalistic lens, the physical world, so to speak, Asiya, it's called, the world of action, is associated with that lowest Sephirah of Malchut. It's where things come into being. It's where things are moving and manifesting. Above that is really the emotional world, you could say, the heart of the divine, the heart of the Godhead. And that is all of those qualities, the loving kindness, the strictness, the compassion. These are those 6 qualities, the heart, if you will, the world of Yitzira, the world of formation. Above that is the world of Bria, the world of creation. And there's different ways of grafting that on, but that's often associated with the world of Bina, the world of understanding, and it's seen as the divine mind. Beyond that, the world of Atzilut, which is the world of emanation, is often traced back to Chokhmah, to that first spark of manifestation. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting. There are, in fact, in some systems, 5 worlds. And the 5th world is called Adam Kadmon, and that's really this realm beyond all articulation. It is not spiritual in the tangible sense. It transcends all of those other worlds and yet simultaneously is interwoven with them. And that can be associated with the highest Sephirah of Keter. And then we start understanding how really the 4 worlds can be 5. And if that's for us, we can have let's say, an intuitive experience, but the 5th world of our being is something that, again, lies beyond that. It's this realm of nothingness or emptiness, which can only be expressed in paradox.
Some of the points that you mentioned just now lead me into the topic of your current book, which is Embodied Kabbalah. So obviously some of the things you've said just now apply very much to this concept of embodied Kabbalah. So would you like to go into your concept of that and say exactly what you mean by that concept?
Yes, absolutely. So if I can use the word Kabbalah to mean the whole history of Jewish spirituality, and that's a very specific usage. I can also use embodiment in a specific way in this book, because the word embodied means a lot of different things right now. It's a little bit of a buzzword even. I don't know if it quite was when I first was conceiving of this project, but thankfully there's a lot of people talking about embodiment, a lot of people talking about somatics, a lot of people talking about groundedness right now. And essentially, when I use the word embodied, I mean this balance between the here and now, the earthly, and the transcendent. And if we could take those 4 worlds and divide them into 2 groups, the head and the soul versus the emotions and the body, embodiment has to do with a very intentional connection to the emotional realm and the physical realm, the path of the sacred bridge, the person who is able to ultimately be a connector between the realms beyond, if you will, the spiritual realms, the transcendent, and the needs of the here and now. So there are many books about the transcendence of Kabbalah. There are many books about the maps of the cosmos in Kabbalah. And this book is different because it's specifically aimed at integration and connection for people. Well, first of all, I think it's a pretty good introduction to Kabbalah as a whole, but it's often people are looking for something a bit more advanced than simply that introduction. And this is a book for people who have a spiritual life, who have a deeper understanding of who they are spiritually and are looking to access a tradition, not in the Cole's Notes form, not in the 101 form, but actually to meet people who are a little bit farther along that path and to understand how Kabbalah can benefit them to be a blessing and to cultivate those skills of really finding those interfaces between those mystical moments, those spiritual experiences, the magic of the universe, and the everyday. Because Judaism has always been a tradition of householders. These are people who have responsibilities every day. We have families or dependents, we have jobs, something like that, where Judaism doesn't have monks and never really has. And so our mystical system has been developed by people with a lot of not just time for spiritual practice, but also needs and duties in other areas of life. So it's about finding that balance point between those 2 worlds.
Well, that's very interesting, very valuable. I mean, one aspect of the Kabbalah that would seem, and this is very traditional, would seem to cut against what you're saying, is this notion that really the Kabbalah is exclusively for Jews. And one strain of the Kabbalistic tradition, and I believe this is continued to this day in Hasidim, is the concept that the goy, the Gentile, only has a nephesh, an animal soul, and not these higher souls, the shama, the ruach, and so on. So the Gentiles are kind of like an animal. And this tradition goes back a long way. How do you respond to this, or how do you feel about it?
Well, I think all of us, when I say all of us, I mean humanity, a lot of our teachings from older times are coming from a place of animosity towards the other. And we are living in a new era. We really are. And as much as there are rumblings, it seems, let's say in the last 10 years of older ways of being that, I'll be honest, I feel scared by, legitimately. I really feel like between the modernity, the Western Enlightenment, sort of lowercase e enlightenment of philosophy. I'm not talking about mystical enlightenment, but we can create societies that are democratic, that are based on rationality and common values. That has led all of us to a place where cultural sharing is not just, we don't just have the opportunity. I think there's actually a necessity. So I share teachings from Kabbalah that I think are going to be valuable for people today. And yeah, we can look back. We can look back at the Bible. We can look back at the Hebrew Bible, the Greek Testament, if you will, right? The Gospels and the letters and all of that. And we can find things that don't sound very nice about people who aren't like us. Similarly, we can look back at, I have gained a lot of insight, for example, from Hindu philosophy. And I know that I can look back on Hindu texts and say, well, there's a lot of othering happening there in some contexts. And same with Christian writings that I've learned from, and Muslim writings and all of that, and Buddhist as well. And what I'm inspired by are things like the mindfulness movement from Buddhism, which really, it starts as a monastic Buddhist practice of a type of meditation that's then studied, taught to scientists like Jon Kabat-Zinn, studied by them. It's shown to be effective, and then it's shared and spread, and now you can get it on your phone. And people are doing it at work, and it's everywhere. And that's been a distillation. And I know Buddhist teachers that I've met who have some questions about how valuable it is to really distill it to that degree. But my point is, I am not someone who judges people based on their ethnicity. And I think people in my own tradition who have said those kinds of things, the best way I can interpret that is they're coming from a place of trauma and injury and damage and oppression and all of those things. And so they're articulating messages which just aren't true. And I don't, it's not a belief for me. I know every person has a great capacity to grow spiritually. And the way you would say that in the language of Kabbalah is that they're accessing their higher levels of their own souls. And I essentially dismiss those teachings. Not only I don't think they're valuable, but I don't think they're true. And I simultaneously have compassion for my own ancestors who were in a situation where they felt compelled to find that kind of, understanding in what they saw around them.
Well, that's a very impressive answer, and thank you so much for dealing with that thorny subject. So let's go on then to the applications of Kabbalistic teaching for ordinary people, both Jews and non-Jews, and how they might apply some of the most important and also probably most basic of these teachings into their day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. And just to highlight, I don't think it's been mentioned yet, the subtitle for my book, Embodied Kabbalah, is Jewish Mysticism for All People. So it is very much intended to open gates and open doorways and to be accessible for people from any background who want to access the material. Because, again, I feel like we're in an era where it's actually very helpful and very needed. And I'll give one example. There's so many I could draw on, but maybe I'll start with this. And if you have any questions on that or want another example, I will absolutely share more. I'm delighted to be speaking with you and all the listeners of the Theosophical Society. The teaching to me that not only in my own heart and mind, but some of my most beloved teachers are saying this, the world right now really needs Shabbat. And what does that mean? The Jewish day of rest, which in the most basic form today is a break from our screens, and they break from the constant news cycle and messages and notifications and all of that, and turning towards delight. And that's delight on all those levels. It's spiritual delight. It's practices which bring us joy and openness and exuberance or even ecstasy. But it's also the delight of the mind. What does that mean? It means focusing on things which are truly wonderful and awe-inspiring, and focusing away from the bad news, otherwise known as the news. They should call it the bad news, because that's what it is. That's what brings us in. Or the to-dos of the world that remind us that things are not whole. That Shabbat in that mindset really is about the wholeness and completion and perfection. And if we can bring ourselves to that place where we really feel that, that's celebration, and that leads to this great refreshment. And so the other pieces of that are, what does emotional delight look like? That can look like being around our beloveds, whatever that means. It could be humans, it could be animals. Sometimes people really need alone time too, and that means the beloved of the self. And I like singing songs. I've written sort of songs that are goofy and delightful and fun to sing with family and friends and all those kinds of things. And there's something about delicious food. That's the fourth world, the physical world. We can actually save our best food for a time where maybe it's a whole day, or maybe it's an evening, maybe it's a lunch break, honestly, but it's really about delighting ourselves in all of those ways and saying no to the screens or to just those messages which remind us that things are broken and things aren't whole yet. So in the teaching that I bring forth, and there's a whole 2 pages in the book, a whole deep teaching about what it means really to cultivate that mindset. It's about bringing ourselves to a place where we feel whole, and not just that our world is complete, but also we are too. The difference between spiritual rest and spiritual work, that there is a time for knowing and noting in ourselves what we're missing. That, oh, I'm feeling particularly angry right now. What's that about? How can I understand that? How can I either make a shift in my own living patterns, or just come to a deeper place where I understand where that anger is arising from so that it can be useful, for example? That's what I would call spiritual work. But spiritual rest is about a celebration and acceptance, a self-love and feeling good, because there's a lot of burnout in our world right now. And there's a lot of just that cycle of worry, and the algorithm loves to keep us hooked on what's next and what's new and what's wrong and what we lack and all of those things. So in my teaching, which is not unique, but it's something I really promote in the world, it's that people ought to find times set aside where they can do intentional rest, refreshment, oasis time, we call it in my home. And it doesn't have to be a full day. It doesn't have to be Friday night to Saturday night. How can people find a time in their own lives when they can do this? Because most of us it's very hard. I'll speak for myself clearly. I'll come out and say this. It's very hard for me to work and be in a Zen state simultaneously to such a degree that I never get burnt out. I actually need time set aside. And that's a very, very important basic fundamental teaching from Kabbalah, from Judaism itself, which I really want to share more with the world.
And of course, it makes perfect sense in our rather frazzled age. But it, to my mind, points the difficulty of this. And Americans are really bad at having fun. And there's nothing worse than, some dreadful family party where everybody's standing around and saying, yeah, we're sure having fun, aren't we? When no one's having anything of the kind. And you get this thing where Americans are so knotted up that their attempts to relax and do the things you say are themselves just another source of stress and another sort of, well, I should be having more fun than this. I should be, enjoying this more than I am. And I think this is a very real problem, and for many people. And how would you suggest someone cope with this?
Well, I would say that I could lay out about 4 or 5 principles right now as a way of preparing for that, let's say, intentional fun. And it doesn't have to be fun necessarily. I think fun is very relaxing and refreshing, but it can also be quiet or peaceful. That there's many ways of doing it. And I really strongly encourage people to find, if I think it is risky if our whole mentality in life is follow your bliss, because then you might be bypassing some of the deeper inner work that might not always feel blissful that we need to do. Sometimes we need to follow where the work is leading inwardly and outwardly. But the Shabbat mindset, this oasis time mindset, is follow your bliss. And that takes preparation. It's not just something we can enter into automatically. So I would ask if someone to try this out. One, this is very simple, is clean your space. That if you're going to be enjoying, make sure that it's tidy, actually. And you might not enjoy tidying, and that's okay, because that's not the restful part. Or hire someone if you can afford it. Just actually have declutter, clean, find a place that feels serene. It could also involve going for a walk in the woods, really. If you don't have time to clean, you want to just tap into that. Two is prepare something physically delightful. And that, I think, the more the merrier, quite frankly. But your favorite food, even if let's say you're in a situation where otherwise it might be hard to have fun, you're eating your favorite food or somewhere in your top 5, let's say, it's going to be hard not to feel pretty good. And so put away your screens. But so let's say clean space, your favorite food or among your favorite foods. And how about this one? Be around the people you want to be around. And I can say, as a parent, there are many joyful moments I share with my children. And sometimes I would like some adult time. So I would say, we try to find that. If we're doing oasis time as a family, we actually try to have a babysitter around for part of that. Or if we're inviting families over, we try to have families with other children. And so the kids will go off and play and the adults can have a good time. But let's say I'm really introverted and I spend so much time around my family or whoever. I don't want to invite people over. Great. I'm going to organize some oasis time where it's just me, and I'm going to have my dependents cared for, and I'm going to make sure that I have what I need, and I'm going to find that space. So I hope you're seeing kind of the direction I'm going in. If someone has an experience of having really a lame time or an unexciting time or a weird time with their friends or family, well, maybe those are not their oasis time people. Maybe it's actually not about that. And there's many forms that this can take. And on some level, if we're talking about the ideal that we could strive for in humanity, yeah, it would be great to be around a loving community and friends and family who we just love to get together with. But let's face it, a lot of people, we're not there. And that's okay. Oasis time really is about a counterbalance. How can we get ourselves to that place? And if that's alone time, or if just being around a couple people, what are we doing when we're there? Are we eating? Are we chit-chatting? Are we in silence? What helps us feel great is the question. And how can we build a practice that points in that direction?
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. Myself, I found one of the most useful ways of going about that is just simply to take a day away from the screens, as you say, just simply no email, no Facebook, anything of the sort, because even half of the things your beloved friends on Facebook say are often enough just upsetting, or they're venting about something or reminding you of like the worst possible thing that's happening in the world right now, which is rarely an enjoyable experience. So I find that just very simple, and it's a very easy thing to do. But I think your suggestions are also really very, very good. Do you have any particular types of meditative practice, either stemming from the Kabbalistic tradition or from other traditions, that you've integrated into your own practice that you would like to discuss?
Yeah, one of the first that comes to mind is nigun. And nigun, it means melody or song. And there's many forms that it shows up in my tradition, but the type that I'm most inspired by comes from the Hasidic tradition, which when it started was a popular mystical movement, much different than the Hasidic communities that we see today, though there are commonalities, and there's been a great amount of spiritual lineage and transmissions preserved there as well. But the original tradition, or I will say the tradition that I draw out from it, because who knows really what the original melodies sounded like, but there are repeating simple melodies that don't have words. They are in fact wordless, and they're more about syllables. One of the teachings I've heard is that there's a part of us that's pre-verbal. And when we sing without words, there's actually a type of there's a way of connecting in on that. And so these are melodies I often sing with groups, whether I'm a participant or I often lead these kinds of sessions. And you can sing the same, let's say the whole melody takes a minute to sing through part A and part B. You can sing that repeated for 20, 30 minutes. And it speeds up and it slows down. And it's a lovely connective practice in a group. And it in a way, the teaching is in the melody itself, and there's experiences that can come from that, but it's also, life can kind of feel like that. It might, sometimes there are cycles to it, but sometimes they grow louder and quieter. Sometimes there's faster or shorter, but there is a way in which there's a beauty in the repetition as well as the changes that come. So that is one of my favorite, I think, explicitly Jewish mystical practices. And the other one that comes to mind, which is a very central part of embodied Kabbalah, is this teaching and orientation towards the body itself as a source of wisdom. And this is, I mentioned somatics in passing earlier on, and this is the big field of somatic psychology, or how neuroscience is studying actually how our nervous systems contain elements of our minds, and how if we interface with our physical sensations, we can gain insight into deeper parts of ourselves. And so this is more of a spiritual work category that a lot of people know the experience of having a pit in their stomach when they're feeling nervous, or if they're feeling anxiety, there's a sense in the center of the chest. And similarly, we can have if I lead people in spiritual counseling sessions, I ask them to think of a spiritual moment or a beautiful moment in their life. And if they really tune into that, they often feel something like a glowing or a warmth in the center of the chest as well. And there's patterns to this, but it's really, it varies and it's independent from moment to moment. But something that I've learned over many years of cultivating this practice is the more that we tune into our physical sensations and understand that they can be gateways to insight, that the more that our body starts communicating to us. And it is possible to have just about every thought and emotion felt somewhere in the body. And there's two real benefits. One, it's greatly insightful that I can tap into a feeling and actually get a sense of its contours, and maybe there's a temperature there and those kinds of things. But then I'll see an image in my mind or have a word come up, and that's a clue to what that feeling's about. And there's a moment that can come where really there's a sense of catharsis, where emotion comes through a thought, there's an insight that accompanies it. And that can lead to a change in action, in a more deeply integrated and natural change in how one might live. And the other key feature here is that our bodies are literally the most physical parts of ourselves, the most earthly, the most grounded. And so if I can cultivate that sense of the connection between mind and body, there's times in which people can literally have spiritual experiences that are felt very explicitly in the nervous system itself. And that's that sense of that bridge. It's, wow, I'm actually grounding this experience through my experience of it. It's actually felt in my body. And it's just a phenomenal moment when someone can have an experience like that, but also there's a great sense of that rooting and that groundedness that can come through that connectivity. And so sometimes that introspection, that spiritual work can actually lead into some of these sefirot, some of these divine manifestations that can come and actually land or be channeled through the body. And there's a lot to be said on that, obviously, but just the spiritual practice of going into the constrictions, if you will. And so we're recording this right before Passover, and Passover metaphorically in Jewish mysticism is this time of being freed from constrictions, being freed from being liberated from the enslavement that we all have in our own ways. And some of it is societal, really, that still exists, very sadly, this kind of oppression, but there's also this sense of the inner oppression that can be freed and worked through with practices like this. And so going into the constrictions might not just lead us to a neutrality or kind of unbinding of them. Sometimes it can lead into great insight and liberation. And that's that kind of passageway that can be honed and harnessed through that kind of physical self-inquiry.
That's very helpful, and that very much ties into the title of your book, which is, of course, Embodied Kabbalah. So that I thought was very insightful. Let's go back to one theme that's kind of emerged in our conversation up to this point, which is Hasidism. Now, Hasidism, as I understand it, started out as a radically ecstatic movement in the Judaism of Eastern Europe in the 18th century. And, with teachers like the Baal Shem Tov and so on. And I believe that your teacher, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, also has deep roots in Hasidism and took a great deal of inspiration from that tradition. Could you talk a little bit about this tradition and say a little bit about the contrast between that and the rather tight versions of Hasidism you see, on a Brooklyn subway?
Sure, and movements change, and in the case of Hasidism, sort of the long story made very short, is that between the challenge of modernity, which met Hasidism very early on in its development, which caused a certain inner turning, and wave after wave of very, very harsh and dark oppression, the Hasidism we see today is impacted by primarily oppression, really, but also that initial turning away from the radical openness and creativity of the first few generations. So the Baal Shem Tov, his name means the master of the good name, sort of the mystic. You could call him, I think, quite accurately an early, or I guess a Jewish mystical shaman of the early to mid 1700s, because he worked with herbal remedies and he worked with amulets and those kinds of things. He was someone who heard insight and intuition from angelic realms that dictated his actions, at least in the stories about him. And he was someone who also renowned as a profound healer and a mystical teacher. So no one quite knows where he came from. He sort of appeared from the mountains in Ukraine in the early-ish 1700s. It could be that he was from Moldova or something like that, but it's very likely he spent a number of years in the mountains and may well have not just learned from Jewish teachers, but also been informed by other sort of mountain folk of the Carpathian Mountains and potentially even Christian mystics of that region. And again, no one can know for sure, but in that era, teachers from these traditions, many of the traditions, Jewish or not, were not openly talking about their interspiritual dialogues they were having in private. It wasn't kind of okay to do that in many circles. So the Baal Shem Tov, wherever he learned from, revealed, they say, he revealed himself, he revealed this radically new teaching, which essentially, it has several components, but one of the biggest ones was that God is not out there. God is not this transcendent force, which you will find much of that kind of talk in previous Kabbalah. And the Baal Shem Tov said, God is right here and right now. God is in every moment. God is in physicality. God pervades the world. And though you'll find some earlier messages like that, the Baal Shem Tov was really explicit and was in many ways reviving a stream of very early Kabbalah, which kind of never really made it in that early era. And so he inspired many people and was also, certainly, if not him, his students were quite controversial because Kabbalah was kept and in many ways for scholars and for people who gained admission into the inner circles more. But the Baal Shem Tov was telling stories and singing melodies, and he was a folk hero. He was popularizing something. And then his main student, or the one of his students who had the most influence after the Maggid of Mezrich, he's called, was essentially empowering his students to go and start movements in many different parts of Eastern Europe. And that's the beginning, really, of the Hasidic movement, which was a very creative, ecstatic, out of the box. And some of those early teachers were excommunicated by Kabbalists and by other mystical teachers and by other teachers because they were kind of starting to maybe turn things over, or maybe even attracting a type of messianism, fervor that there were some people who were concerned with. I mean, for good reason. There's been no shortage of messianic movements inspired by Kabbalah and Judaism that have caused tumult and sort of tragedy in various ways. So early Hasid, I'll share one more teaching, is they started, you see, right before the modern era hit them, to ask very penetrating questions, and you can tell in their interpretations. They say things like, well, maybe this Torah scroll, or the Torah, the written texts, that's one form of the divine wisdom, but maybe that divine wisdom is actually everywhere in the world, because we know that there were great heroes of the Bible who lived before the Torah was given, before our sacred text. So what were they studying? And well, they were studying the Torah of reality, the Torah of nature. And so if someone is having experiences of the divine being everywhere, they start asking themselves, well, is the divine found in this book more than that book, or in this day more than that day? There's stories of the early Hasidic teachers trying to do Shabbat in the middle of the week instead of Friday night to just see if it would happen. And they were shocked when it worked. Those kinds of things. And so you're getting challenges and creativity, but modernity comes along. There's a certain, I think, a recoiling, and it was much of the religious world, right? Not just the Jewish world, not just the Hasidic world, but there was a sense of what is this? Is there a threat here? And then not long after that, the next wave, I guess, of the change in the Hasidic world in the 1800s is the, pogroms and those kind of oppression, and Eastern European Jews were no stranger to violence and basically othering coming. And so that leads to more inwardness. And then the final sort of phase, and we're really still living in the aftermath of that, is the Holocaust. And that was, many of the Hasidic lineages ceased to exist because of the Holocaust. And most of them that survived, it was kind of just barely, if you know what I'm saying. The biggest Hasidic movement today is Chabad, Lubavitch, and they go back to the 1700s. Their founder was the student of the Baal Shem Tov. They go back a long time, and they were always well organized because their founder was one of these rare people who wasn't just mystically gifted. He was organizationally gifted. He was musically gifted. He was all of these. He had a ton of talents. And they also had established themselves more so in the United States before the Holocaust. And so they were able to make it out better than almost every other Hasidic group. But you'll see that there's a way in which cloistering, turning inward, is a self-preservation tool. And I will say, even within that, I have had profound experiences spending time with Hasidic communities in Jerusalem, for example. And these are communities that I wouldn't, let's say, cast my lot with in the larger sense, because there's a lot of ways in which their views of the world don't mesh with mine when it comes to, let's say, issues of gender or issues of inclusion or modernity and all of those things. But singing circles that go on for hours with these strange atonal melodies that just fill the hall. It's a very mystical moment that you can have in a community like that. And they're preserving a certain light and energy, which is hard to find elsewhere. So I'll conclude this answer by saying there's a neo-Hasidic movement, which is the revival of the spirit of Hasidism, which in many ways has happened throughout the generations. But Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, my teacher, was an example. One expression of that, my teacher, Rabbi Arthur Green, is an expression of that. And in many ways, Embodied Kabbalah, the book, is an expression of a renewal of that Hasidic, the radical, the creative, the mystical, the ecstatic, but contained in a way that it's relevant for this era.
That's great. That's a fabulous and very comprehensive answer. Thank you. This leads me, you mentioned Jerusalem, and this leads me to ask about another place in Israel that you may have had some contact with, which is, what is it called today? Sfat.
Yeah, good. That's a hard one to pronounce.
Which was the center of the Kabbalistic movement in the 16th century with Cordovero and Isaac Luria and so on. My impression is that there are a number of Kabbalists practicing there today. I'm wondering if you've been there, if you had any contact with any of them.
I've spent some time in Sfat. It's not a place that I've studied extensively. I've studied much more in Jerusalem, though Isaac Luria's school especially, it was incredibly influential. It's impossible to really read any later Jewish mysticism just about without encountering Isaac Luria's thought. And I learn a lot of Moshe Cordovero's thought as well. He was sort of the last word of Kabbalah before Lurianic Kabbalah. And he was prolific and gifted and wrote the encyclopedia of all of Kabbalah that of his time, but in his 20s or something like that. It really a rare mind and a spiritual wisdom that is not usually cultivated until one is much older, if at all. And so Isaac Luria comes along, teaches for less than 2 years, dies, and his students, based on his teachings, create this movement, which influences many people, including the Baal Shem Tov and Hasidism and all of that. So a lot of his teachings are just around. And I haven't studied in Tzfat itself, but Lurianic Kabbalah is pervades the Kabbalistic universe, you could say, and same with Cordovero's work as well. So I have quite a lot of exposure to that, though I'm more versed in Zohar and Hasidism than explicitly Lurianic Kabbalah. But for example, what I mentioned with the 5 worlds, Adam Kadmon, that I'm not sure if that tradition exists before Luria, and so that's the 5th world of the sort of primordial Adam, I guess you could say, as a literal translation. This paradoxical reality that encompasses all the rest is a fairly Lurianic view. And same with the 5 levels of soul, which we sort of hinted at before. I think you did, but there's the animal soul, if you will, the nefesh, the ruach, the, I guess, heart-centered soul, the neshama, and the head, the chaya, which is above the head, and yechida, which is even above that, and that's associated with Adam Kadmon, with this realm of the paradoxical kind of, it's even beyond unity, because unity implies there's a duality somewhere and all of that, and that is a Lurianic principle. So I've learned more about those principles than I have actually spent time in Tzvat, though I know a number of people who learn more in Tzvat explicitly. And it's just really just one of that school is just one of the many iterations, and it shows how much the lineages do change over time. That I don't know. I actually am curious. Maybe you know where the term, the definite article before Kabbalah comes in, because I guess in the Jewish world, I've just called it Kabbalah, and it was sort of how to say that, not self-aware. It was just, that's how we called it. And if I were to interpret it, perhaps Kabbalah, to me, one of the reasons I like it, or I haven't switched to the Kabbalah, maybe there's a sociological element there, right? There's different groups that call these things slightly different things, but I like Kabbalah because it's, without the in front of it, implies it's sort of a maybe fluid, perhaps. And I've thought about it more recently because people talk about the occult as well. And I don't imagine people who, let's say, are practitioners of the occult think about it as this one solid thing that never moves or changes, but maybe I could be wrong. Do you have a sense, Richard, of the kind of differentiation there?
Well, I don't know Hebrew texts well enough to know when and where the definite article was used there. It's pretty much a matter of English idiom to call it the Kabbalah rather than Kabbalah, although I have noticed that Jewish teachers like you use it without the definite article. I'm just thinking of it more in terms of, I just associate it as idiomatic usage, and you're quite right. The occults, the Kabbalah, again, they're whatever you want to call them in terms of however of the definite article, they are very fluid and rich traditions. Let's go mention one thing that you just brought up yourself, which is the Zohar, which is certainly the most important text of the Kabbalistic tradition. I see you have a set of it right behind you.
Yes, the English set, which is very good translation here.
And it's an extremely important work. But it's a very compendious work and also extremely dense one. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Zohar and how you work with it and what insights you've gotten from it and how.
Well, do you have another few hours? I will say, so the Zohar, I guess in the biggest sense, one of the ways I'm inspired by the Zohar is it shows this brilliance in preserving teachings for future generations, because the Zohar could have been, this thick and just been a list of the Sefirot and the ways in which they are useful or impactful or what they are, their dynamics and those kinds of things. And there is a book like that from the same era called Sha'arei Ora, Gates of Light, which most people haven't heard of because it's essentially a list of divine names and a little bit about each one. But what the Zohar did is it took this teaching of the Sefirot and it articulated it using the language of the Torah, using the language of the Bible and the Midrashim, these early rabbinic teachings. And it basically interwove the Sefirot with Jewish lore. And why is that inspiring? One, it makes for fascinating reading. And these are, wow, what novel interpretations, but also That is the formula that every great work has used in Jewish history to start a new era and to preserve itself in the process. So another example is the Talmud, the teachings of the rabbis. That was in many ways a new set of laws, or certainly a changed or expanded. This is called the oral law. It's the fact that we call it the oral law shows the ingenuity and cleverness of the early rabbis, because it was a new legal system that was inspired by biblical law, but really different. And what did they do? The whole Talmud's, you could argue, the main project of this massive thousands of pages and many, many books and volumes, the project is to interweave rabbinic insights with the scriptures, with the Bible, and to make it sound like these new insights were very ancient. And I don't want to kind of lower the esteem of the project by saying that I think in modern standards, it's very important to have intellectual honesty and to say, well, this is my idea. But in the old world, it didn't seem like a lot of people thought that, or maybe they had other understandings of where this wisdom came from. But essentially, the Zohar's brilliance in the largest sense is to interweave the Sefirot with Jewish lore and Jewish teachings, which causes it then to be part of the Torah tradition, to be part of the wisdom tradition. And if someone wants to make an impact for one or two generations, they just speak it like it is. You know, you're direct. But if you want multi-generational impact, you have to weave it in with what comes before. And that's true in the Jewish world. And I would say it's true in a lot of our worlds that have writing, that have legends, that have teachings, that if we can be interfacing our new ideas with what comes before us, that's a great combination for preserving our insights for many generations to come. And so my book, Embodied Kabbalah, could have been written as a series of things that I learned over the years, but it's not. It is a 42 mystical text that reflects the insights that I hold most dear, that I think are valuable for the world right now. And I let the text do the talking instead of myself. So in the biggest sense, that is why I love the Zohar, but in a smaller way, in a more, let's say, specific way, one of the things I learned most is the way that the Zohar describes the Shekhinah, describes that most accessible Sephirah. And there's many ways of relating to it, but in the embodied Kabbalah sense, in the sort of transmission that I received from one of my teachers, if we can understand this most accessible Sephirah as the energy body, I think that can really open up a lot. That if I have access to the nervous system and the way it interfaces with my body, emotions, mind, spirit, once I can do that, I have opened the gate towards deeper insights and wisdom. You could also think about the Shekhinah as just simply opening up to the sort of flow and the potential of what lies beyond. But in this embodied sense, the Shekhinah is described as the opening of the tent, as a metaphor, like the opening of the tent of Abraham and Sarah. That's a biblical metaphor, and it's talking about this first encounter we can have with spirit. And so what does that mean that, we open up the tent? That's really our first opening to spiritual potential, to spiritual reality. And from that, there are different types of contact we can have with the world that lies beyond. And so a lot of the work for us humans is opening the tent, is getting access, and that can come through clearing the way in our constrictions. It can come through magical moments of Shabbat consciousness and joy and all of that. But I see the Zohar as a coded description for that pathway to what lies beyond, and also as a fascinating book of spiritual cosmology whose mysteries are really hard to fully understand, which is part of the fun and the learning and the adventure of studying Kabbalah.
That's great. That's been very enlightening for me. Thank you so much for that. We're coming fairly close to the end of, I think, the time that might be useful to spend on the interview. But let me ask you one question that is of interest to me. What do you make of the Sefer Yitzira, which is, strictly speaking, Book of Formation, which is generally regarded as the oldest and first Kabbalistic text, also, of course, the shortest, unlike the Zohar. Do you have any thoughts about that particular work?
I do, and this is more informed from academic, I guess, opinions of it. And I'll be straight up and say I am not a leading expert in Sefer Yitzira. I'm much more, let's say, competent of teaching Hasidic wisdom or Zohar than I would be of Sefer Yitzira. So it's not something I've really probed the depths of. But I think, dominant understanding by historians is that the Sefer Yitzira comes from a different school than the Zohar, than the Bahir. It is not Kabbalah per se. It talks about Sefirot, but likely when it uses that, it literally means numbers. It means that, because you could translate Sefirah as number, but whoever wrote these early books of Kabbalah surely was inspired by the language of Sefer Yitzira, but it's not clear that when that book first is written, you'll find, let's say, traditional views that it was written by Adam, as in Adam and Eve, or by Abraham. Now, I am not someone who tends to buy those traditional accounts. Something that is certain, it's a book of magic and mystery, and it's very engaging to study, but I don't personally place it in the lineage of Kabbalah. I would place it in the specific usage, right? In the usage of my book, it is Kabbalah because it's Jewish mysticism, but I don't see it as the medieval movement of the Sefirot as it's laid out. I see it as sort of a precursor to that, and it could go back all the way. It could go back 2,000 years. It could go back sometime in the 9th century or something. There's different ways of dating it, but I see it as a mysterious, wonderful book. And every time I have learned it, I've really enjoyed it, but I don't place it in the same specific school as the Bahir, the Zohar, Isaac Luria, Moshe Cordovero, even, you know what I mean? That is its own world. And I see basically the Sefer Yitzira as a magical, mystical writing that is unique in and of itself in most ways.
Yeah, just to put a little chronological perspective on it for listeners, as I understand it, the scholarly date usually given for the Sefer Yitzira, sometime between the 3rd and the 6th centuries AD. The Bahir, the Book of Splendor, the 12th century AD.
There's, with remnants that are now being traced to earlier, even I think to the 11th or 10th centuries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the Zohar, in something like the form we have it now, the 13th century. With Gloria in the 16th century. I know there are many ifs, ands, and buts.
Sure, yeah, the Sefer Yitzira some date later than that too, but yeah, it could go back all the way to the Mishnaic era, which is sort of the early rabbinic writings. It's really, I kind of like that we can't date these specifically. I kind of like that it's not always clear what people were intending, because that adds to the mystery of it. It is possible using academic mindsets to kind of take the fun out of some of these older books. I don't ascribe to that. The mystery is always going to be there, and I think sometimes our ancients were intentionally writing in code because they didn't want people around them to know necessarily. So there's very generative, but yes, there is a great timeline, and so the Isaac Luria is living in the 16th century, and then today it's easier to know sort of when certain teachers were living, but there's a lot of mystery. And one piece I'd just like to add is it seems as though starting in the 1400s, so the 15th century, in Italy, I believe, Christian Kabbalah gets birthed, and that has its own, sometimes overlapping, but often independent trajectory throughout the European, I guess, late Middle Ages, Renaissance, and even up until, my understanding is that the Theosophical Society itself, which had a lot of inspiration from Kabbalah right in the foundings, was in many ways informed by Christian Kabbalah at the outset. And this was at a time, interestingly, in Jewish history where a lot of Jewish people were not studying Kabbalah. And so it's a very interesting interplay. I myself have had contact and studied Theosophic Kabbalah and some of those offshoots at the same time that I was sort of learning about Kabbalah from the, let's say, Jewish academic sources primarily, or within the Orthodox Jewish world. So there's an interesting interplay in the modern era, but I have understood that a lot of Christian Kabbalah kind of developed in its own independent, you could say, lineage, and in a way which obviously was inspired by things like the Zohar and Kabbalah from the Jewish world, but then fed into other movements, including the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, that's true. And that's, of course, an incredibly intricate discussion, but that's basically the way I understand it. So, all right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. And I think that's probably enough for one interview. But if you have anything you would like to say, just that point you want to emphasize, or bring up something that we hadn't discussed so far, would you like to do that?
Yeah, I'll share one other teaching from Embodied Kabbalah, which is really gets to the essence of what it means to do spiritual work. So if spiritual rest really is about joy and going towards positivity, spiritual work is about turning towards negativity or difficulty or constriction. And a person has to be resourced in order to do that. So I wouldn't, I don't think it's possible to really do productive inner work unless a person is already at a baseline of well-being. So that's important. Sometimes we actually shouldn't be going into that cave, into the darkness, but the central teaching, or I could really say the central teaching around this, it has to do with going down for the sake of rising up, what's called in Hebrew yerida letzorech aliyah. And one of my favorite metaphors actually comes from the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is Gandalf the Grey. If people know this, in the first book of The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf is leading this troop into the mines of Moria, and they face this horrible foe called the Balrog, and he descends. Literally, the Balrog takes him into the underworld with him, and he spends weeks, I think, battling it. And when he finally overcomes the Balrog, he doesn't just go back to being Gandalf the Grey, this wizard, this magic worker. He becomes Gandalf the White, the most powerful good guy in the whole universe. And it's because he descended and faced his demons and faced the negativity and went into that. He journeyed through it, and he came out more whole, more profoundly realized than he had been at the beginning. And that's what it means to go down for the sake of rising up. And we can have little moments like that, and we can also have larger moments, but that's the journey that the people of Israel they merited to receive the Torah because they had been enslaved in Egypt. They go down into that for generations. And it actually, though it's oppressive, it has this refining characteristic that the later Jewish mystics understand there. And that's why we need to not call suffering to us, if you know what I'm saying, but we're all going to have it in one form or another. And the promise and the hope of the spiritual work is that we can not just kind of move beyond it or move through it, but actually grow in the process. And when we have a balance between that and the spiritual rest, that's part of living a holistic and healing life. That's part of being a blessing, is actually growing through difficulty, finding moments of appreciation and rest, and ultimately keeping ourselves rooted in the process so we can learn in all those four worlds and grow and develop and, fulfill our purpose here. Because I think it's a very purpose-driven teaching, a very purpose-driven lineage. And I really believe that strongly, that we're each here for our own reason.
Thank you so much. This has been a great interview. We've covered a lot of ground, and you've given us a lot of depth and insight in this last hour or so. So in conclusion, I just want to say thank you. Your book sounds fascinating, and I wish you much success with it.
Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate the conversation with you today.